Oh, wow. So we see when the other people join.
Good morning, friends. In welcome to Dr. Ambedkar Karwan's page. Today, we have young leaders with us from One World Exchange. As we are in the period addressing this COVID-19, uh, similar situation what we are facing in India is being faced by our brothers and sisters in United States. The death rate is higher as compared to other ethnic groups and communities, or precisely with the white people. So, in order to respond to this situation and how our brothers and sisters in United States has been fighting against this racism, we are we are discussing today on the subject legal strategies of black movement to combat racism. And we have on the panel today the founders of One World Exchange, Tiffany Gardner. Welcome, Tiffany, and
Hi.
Dana Olds.
Hello.
So, One World Exchange is a platform where uh, young students, young leaders, young activists from marginalized section are exposed to different situations to provide leadership. We've been introduced to One World Exchange almost a decade earlier, and we had a couple of exchange in India, facilitated by Manuski and introduced by Sharmista and Lalit. Then uh, we had a great program during this time. Uh, Today, when we are discussing this subject, let me give me a brief that anti-caste movement very early on was interested in the black movement, in the race in America and caste in India. Uh, Social reformer Mahatma Jyotiba Phule was very much inspired by the writings of Thomas Paine, and he dedicated his book Slavery to the good people of America. uh, Sayajirao Gaikwad was also took keen interest in the black movement, and he in the elementary education he introduced uh, readings about George Washington and so on. Thereafter, of course, Baba Sahib took keen interest when he was a student there in Columbia University, and one of our uh, eminent member today, Tiffany, is from Columbia alumni. So would be more interested to know on the details of uh, the Columbia's university involvement as a student and so on. So Baba Sahib took a very keen interest in these aspects, and he very much compared repetitively the slavery and untouchability. He wrote extensively on that. He also wrote later to W.E.B. Du Bois, founder of NAACP, National Association for Advancement of Colored People. And there he wrote, and I read, there is so much similarity between the position of the untouchables and the position of the Negroes of America, that the study of latter is not only natural but necessary. And you all know that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. visited India. He was also inspired by the non-violence movement. But when he was in India, he was being introduced to the audience as untouchable of the America, and he 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 developed he was very much sort of uh, taken aback when he was uh, said as an introduced as an untouchable of America. He later on pondered on that it will be good to go through his video and speeches when he made that remark. But equally, when he was introduced by the leaders then in India to the Constitution, he was also inspired by the constitutional provisions, and later on he developed and advocated poor people campaign and bill of rights for the disadvantaged. So there is a strong connection between these two movements, and of course, Dalit Panther in India was very much inspired by the coinage of Black Power by Malcolm X, and uh, sort of defined by Stokely Carmichael, and also the uh, Black Panther movement. So, without taking much time, uh, let me let it hand over to Dena, who would like to introduce uh, the One World Exchange, the program and activities, and later on we will go through the sort of subject which we are discussing today, the strategies, legal strategies of the Black movement to combat racism. Over to you, Dana.
So, thank you, Priya. And good morning, everybody on the Facebook Live. So, thank you for inviting us today for this talk. As you mentioned already, One World Exchange, we're an organization that was founded a little over 10 years now to expose people from underrepresented backgrounds. Yes, I have the low volume issue. So, can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay, great. So One World Exchange, we were founded to really expose youth of underrepresented backgrounds to human rights and development. And we've had the pleasure to partner with Minuski Center and with Priya and Mangesh and all of our other collaborators for a number of years now, and send delegations of young people to India to work together on issues related to improvement of the condition for Dalits, and also so it's a two-way exchange. So much has been given back to as well to our young leaders in terms of organizing and working on solidarity networks. So it's been an amazing partnership. But overall, One World, we send students overseas generally in the summer to do service projects on international human rights and development. And we've been very pleased to partner with Priya and everyone in India. And so, and that's what we do, every summer. So, uh, that's One World in a nutshell. And we also do programs such as this, where we get out and speak to people about issues related to human rights and development. So thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Uh, the One World Exchange program we hosted in Manuski, then it has given a larger platform to understand each other. And I do remember many students, activists who was part of it later on wrote their pieces in their blogs on their social media platforms about the caste and untouchability issue, trying to draw parallels between two communities, taking up issues with the local government, and trying to extend the affiliation and to the people who have migrated from India or the Ambedkarite communities in US and so on. Coming back to the subject, uh, when we talk about legal strategies in order to address the bigger issues like racism or the slavery, uh, and particularly from a legal campaign or litigation point of view, there are many factors. As a student of law, we go through some of the theories like critical race theory or some of the landmark judgments like Brown versus Board of Education or many other cases. But the advocacy rights campaign organizations, the people who has moved that campaign, the resources, the financial assistance, the legal support structure provided to sustain such litigations, we hardly come across. And therefore, in order to understand those success in those litigations, it's very necessary to know the people, the organizations, their strategies, uh, their way of mobilization, not only of resources, but also taking it forward as a social process, developing that sort of, say, in terms of caste consciousness or race consciousness among the people. Uh, Also, when we talk about litigations, the judiciary is very important. The leadership of judiciary is very important. The socio-political situation, uh, the independence of judiciary, all things are very, very important. And if you take the celebrated case like Brown versus Board of Education, it took more than 25 years. So in order to understand the nitty-gritties, in order to understand the complexities of developing such litigations, developing such campaigns, let's hear from Tiffany, who is graduated as human rights law, and also who has been involved uh, in many sort of international human rights advocacy issues and public sort of interest issues. She also been associated with South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. She also part of United Nations International Law Commission and Human Rights Watch. Let me tell to the audience for uh, the issue of advocating caste at an international forum. Human Rights Watch is the agency who has come up with the report Broken People in 1999, which was very helpful for taking it to the Durban conference, which we will talk later. Uh, she was also part of National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, and as a law graduate, and uh, she was involved into many other legal aspects and legal issues. So, without taking much time, over to you, Tiffany.
Awesome. And Priya, are you able to let me in? So I'm on my laptop. It'd be much easier that way.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, let me in and then we can do the presentation. Perfect. Thank you. Awesome. And as I'm getting let in, are you able to share the slideshow that I have?
Yeah, just a moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Good. So I'm going to start at the beginning. Thank you, Priya, for this very kind introduction. And I'm trying to make sure that you can see me. Are you able? Perfect, you are able to see me. So thank you again for this very kind introduction. And everyone's able to hear me, I hope? Okay, good. So yes, I am a human rights lawyer by training, and I have worked in several social progress and social justice movements around the world, including here in the United States. So when I got the invitation to speak about our particular movement for social change and how possibly some of these strategies could be used with the Dallas Right movement, I was very excited to be a part of it. And this has been a very long-standing partnership between One World and Minuski Center and the Dallas Rights community. And so we're very honored, honestly, to be in solidarity with you and to really be walking hand in hand with you. So without further ado, if you could please go to the first slide. So we're going to talk about legal strategies that have been used, particularly in this country. Sorry, give me 1 second, get my computer here. So we're going to turn this off. Okay, perfect. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. And everyone, I'm in New York. So I'm in New York City, so it's about midnight here. So we may have a little bit of technical difficulties, but we'll soldier on. So we're going to talk about legal strategies that the Black movement used here in this country around rights and action and obtaining our rights. And again, maybe possibly how it could be useful in the Indian context. You can go to the next slide, Priya. So one of the things that I really want to be careful about in this conversation is that everything that was done during the civil rights movement was a part of a larger strategy. I think a lot of times we think about civil rights, particularly in the US, it's very romanticized. And we have these sort of big heroes, our Martin Luther Kings, our Malcolm X, our Stokely Carmichael. But I think the importance of strategy cannot be underscored enough. In fact, you really can't talk about the legal strategy in the United States civil rights movement without talking about all the other strategies that really were part and parcel to the legal strategy, right? So even before they brought their first case to court, there was a whole strategy involving building the grassroots movement, building solidarity, doing test cases. So it's not as if just one day they decided to bring Brown v. Board to the Supreme Court and voila, they won. But in fact, this was a 30, 40-year process, a very diligent, intentional strategy. So this right here is a picture of NAACP leaders, and they're at a strategy conference on civil rights. And I think this just really underscores the importance of strategy to the movement from the very beginnings and throughout. You can go to the next slide, Priya. So part one, and well, you know what? I'm delineating it by number, but this isn't necessarily chronologically how it happened, but in some ways it is, right? So part one of the movement was really building the base, right? So if you're really going to have any movement that has a groundswell and that really is going to have an impact and kind of give a real seismic shift to society, you from what I've seen anyway, successful movements have to have a base, right? You have to build your base. Who do you got? And so you see right there in the center is Dr. King at the Black church. And by and large, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the base was the Black church, right? It really started out as a religious movement. And it's not lost upon any of us that most of the leaders of the civil rights movement were clergymen. They were pastors, they were ministers. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and others were based in the church, right? And there was such a power in the Black church at that time with the numbers, right? The numbers of people there and the commitment there. So the base of the movement was in the church. Once you really develop that base, right? And usually the base does start with those who are directly impacted, right? But you don't just stop there, right? Again, if you're trying to make a seismic shift, a colossal change to the current system, you need to have a larger base than those that are just directly impacted. And so the leaders of the civil rights movement understood that. And so you'll also see where they began to reach out. You'll see where they got Hollywood, for instance, celebrities involved. This picture in the lower left-hand corner is Harry Belafonte and some other Hollywood actors, right? And then here, this picture in the upper right-hand corner is James Baldwin, again, with other Hollywood actors. So they did enlist the help of Hollywood, starting with Black Hollywood, you know, again, your low-hanging fruit, that makes sense. But soon after that, the base really did extend beyond Black Hollywood. So this is the initial base. You can go to the next slide. And then after that, again, back to the base in this whole idea of solidarity, right? They extended beyond, again, the low-hanging fruit, beyond their own community. So they did work a lot with the religious community. You'll see that the Catholic community was very involved. The Jewish community was very involved. Students were very involved, particularly white students from the North. They would have freedom summers. And again, all of this was a part of a very coordinated, technical, intentional plan. A lot of times when one thinks about solidarity and coalition building, it takes work, right? It takes work. when you think about members of a coalition, some things they can sign on that you're trying to do, other things they can't sign on. There's politics on both sides. So for instance, to have the Catholic community involved, to have the Jewish community involved, there was lots of negotiations there with them and the civil rights leaders, right? There was some give, there was some take. If you even think about King's letter from Birmingham jail, right? So that's when he was jailed, and he wrote a letter while in jail, and he wrote it to the religious community, not to the Black religious community, which again was his primary base, but to the white religious community. And there was a little bit of a tension there, right? Between how far he wanted to go and the civil rights leaders wanted to go, and how far, white religious community thought he should go. And one of his favorite lines in there is, well, how long must we wait? You keep saying to wait, to wait, to wait, sort of this incremental change. Well, how long must we wait? And that just, again, highlights for you that the work of building the base and building solidarity is long and difficult work. You can go to the next slide. So in addition to domestic solidarity, there was also international solidarity. You'll see our leaders, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King in particular, they engaged in the international community. So the picture at the top right-hand corner is Malcolm X with Fidel Castro. You'll also see a picture here at the bottom left of Martin Luther King getting the Nobel Peace Prize, again, getting that global national stage. Then right next to that picture, right in the middle, is Martin with Kwame Nkrumah, the first democratically elected president of Ghana. Up above is Malcolm here, rather the lower right-hand corner is Malcolm in Africa. Again, these are just all pictures of sort of the international aspect of the movement as well, right? Even in the work that I do here in the US, and right now I'm doing work around women's representation and getting more women elected, I always say, even in this country, sometimes it's easier to move an issue and to move a social justice issue outside of the country and then bring it home. Sometimes you can get sort of more attention if you go outside of your country and have someone over there talking about what's going on at home. And then that gets the leaders at home and the power holders at home to pay attention. And so this was a part of the strategy as well, right? They didn't just leave their advocacy and their activism to the US borders, right? But they went abroad, they took it abroad, and they got solidarity while they were abroad. Next slide, please. So we talked about the importance of having a base, right? And building your base from the directly impacted, building the base from your community. But then we also talked about the importance of broadening that base, how the leaders, again, went to Hollywood, starting with Black Hollywood, but really broadening that, went to the religious communities, both Catholic and Jewish. We talked about the importance of domestic solidarity and doing that, as well as international solidarity. And then it's time for mobilization, right? And even in the mobilization, being very intentional about that, and when you marched and where you marched and who was a part of the march and the optics of the march. Again, I'm going to keep going back to this theme of intentionality, right? And the amount of time that it really took to craft what they did, and in some ways just how phenomenal what they did truly was. Yes, it was phenomenal in that they were able to get the successes that they got, but for me, what's even more mind-boggling is the amount of just concerted, intentional effort. Each step was basically calculated out. So this wasn't a thing that was sort of willy-nilly by the seat of their pants, making it up as you go. But I mean, strategy after strategy after strategy session, meeting after meeting, discussion after discussion, and then you get this sort of as the product. But again, we can't miss the importance of the strategy and intentionality. So then you get to mass mobilization, right? And this is kind of almost like the Hearts and Minds campaign. So now once you have your base, right? Once you got your base, once you have, your solidarity, both domestic and international, now what do you do with that, right? And that's sort of a real asset, a real wealth. So what do you do with that? Well, now this is a time for the Hearts and the Minds campaign. So let's get this this army, so to speak, that we have, and now let's really try to move this issue. So with the mass mobilization, it included several things. Marches, as we know. You can see there in the top right-hand corner with Harry Belafonte and Martin Luther King marching. Also, you see the NAACP in the lower left-hand corner. But also the gruesome nature what they were up against, right? So you see this poster here of the 3 boys that were killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi, again, a part of Freedom Summer, and they were killed. They were killed by a white mob, right? Then you see this picture really that I centered this slideshow with the 4 little girls. I'm not sure how many in India are familiar with this story, but there was a bombing of a church in Birmingham, right? And it was during the Sunday school hour. Especially during that time in our nation's history, church was a very big affair and was very important in the African American community. And the early hours of church, it still is today, is designated for Sunday school when most of the kids are there. And so this man decided to bomb a church during the Sunday school hour when he knew that children would be there. And as a result, these 4 angels were killed, and it made national news. They're the parents of one of the girls, and it was a real mobilizing effect. It was a very sad time, and it was a very mobilizing effect. But again, it began to broaden the community of people that actually not just cared about this, but felt like, you know what, this has gone too far and we must do something. And then you'll also see in the left-hand corner, the sign that says a man was lynched yesterday. So again, the mass mobilization. A part of what the movement had to do is make this a concern, civil rights, make civil rights a concern, not just for the directly impacted, not just for African Americans feeling the weight, right, of Jim Crow, feeling the weight of segregation. So not just to make it an issue for them, which it already was, not to just make it an issue for those who were in solidarity with them, but to make it an issue for those maybe who weren't impacted at all, right, who had, you know, no skin in the game, as they say, at all. And these were some of the efforts that were used to do that. So once you kind of have this issue in the nation's consciousness, right, that it is an issue, A, and that it's an issue that needs to be addressed, well, then we can talk about, well, let's talk about legal strategies as well. And a lot of times the mass mobilization, the marches, the demonstrations, they were in tandem with a legal strategy, right? So you can't really dissect them and say, well, let's just talk about the legal strategies, right? You can't dissect them, but it's all a part of a concerted effort. You can go to the next slide. So legal strategies, let's talk about that. So for those who are lawyers in India, I know that the Indian judicial system is similar to the US. And one of the big things that we as lawyers always learn about early on is precedence. And that just basically means that whatever case came before, whatever case comes after that has to sort of follow the same rule, the same guidelines, the same principles. So precedent is a very big thing, and it's something that's difficult to overcome. So for African Americans in this country, and especially for civil rights leaders, they had really the Herculean effort to overcome legal precedent. And the one case that really was sort of the linchpin of it all was Plessy v. Ferguson. So you have the Civil War, which ended in 1865. At that time, you had Reconstruction, which arguably was meant to provide access and resources to African Americans who had formerly been enslaved, right? Everything from money to education. And interestingly enough, during the time of Reconstruction, you had just a wealth of Black folks being elected to office, both governorships, being elected as senators. You had a huge creation of Black wealth as well. So it was a very fruitful time for African Americans, just because it was at one moment in time where the US government said, we are going to take a concerted effort to right these wrongs. And honestly, that in a lot of ways has not been done since then, right? So with that being said, you have a man by the name of Homer Plessy. He's living in New Orleans, Louisiana, and this is Reconstruction, and things are going well. Well, slowly but surely, the more that you had African American progress, you also had a backlash. And a part of that backlash were these segregation laws, what became known as Jim Crow laws, separating the races. And so for those who've been to New Orleans, you know, they have the streetcar in New Orleans where you sort of get around, and it's sort of a tram or a train. And Homer Plessy gets on the train, and he's told that he has to sit in the back of the train, a segregated train car. And again, not to get too much into the story of Homer, but again, this was a test case as well. Again, he didn't just randomly say, today's the day I'm going to fight this, but this had been a test case as well. Again, intentionality. Well, he sued and said, this is not fair under the 14th Amendment. This is not fair under equal protection. I'm an American citizen. I should be able to sit wherever I can. And the huge ruling, it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the huge ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson was that it can indeed be separate. It just has to be equal. As long as it's equal, it can be separate. And hence, from that day forward, that's when you had the institutionalization of segregation and the institutionalization of Jim Crow. And you can see here in this cartoon where it says the ruling in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson is separate but equal. And then you see the African-American Plessy all the way in the back of the colored part of the court. So the other sort of absurdity of the whole thing is that, yes, it was separate, but it certainly wasn't equal. So this was really the case that had been law since 1896, that up until the 1950s, civil rights leaders were still trying to fight this legal precedent. You can go to the next slide. So what were the realities? And I kind of hinted to that. So now you have Plessy, 1896. Segregation is now the law of the land, separate but equal. So what does that really mean? Was it really separate? Was it really, well, it was separate, but was it really equal? Well, here's the realities, especially as it relates to education. On the left side of the slide, you have schools attended by African-American children. And on the right side of the slide, you have schools attended by white children. And, you know, a picture's worth 1,000 words. I don't think I need to really highlight the differences in the two schools. A lot of times, African-American schools, the buildings were in disrepair. They would have to have schools outside. Their books were older. It was often practiced that at the beginning of the school year, the African-American children would get the books that the white kids used the year before. So they would have like gum in them, they would have marks in them. And so they would spend, you know, a good portion of the beginning of the school year cleaning up those books that the white kids had so they would be able to use them. Very limited supplies, overcrowding. And honestly, this picture right here in the middle really just is a heartbreaker, because you see these you know, lovely, beautiful African-American children looking at this very nice playground that they can't even access because it's for whites only. So when you talk about the realities of segregation in school during that time, it wasn't just the classroom, but it was also extracurriculars. It was the pool, it was the tennis court. You know, their lives were as separate as can be in every aspect of it. And so I want to stop and just put a pin right here that, so the issue for the civil rights leaders was not that Black kids should go to school with white kids. Right, so there wasn't sort of this sort of intrinsic value that they should go to school with white kids. It was more so that their schools were so inadequately inferior to the white schools, right? And so in this country, every child is guaranteed a right to a quality education. So if you look at those pictures on the left, you let me know if you think that's a quality education as compared to the pictures on the right. So they thought, well, what is the best way that we can make sure that our children get that quality education that the white children are getting? And hence the answer was, well, let's integrate the schools. And then that way, our children can have access to those same resources that white children haven't access to. You can go to the next slide. So talking about the road to Brown. And this is a great website for those who are interested. It talks about, again, all of the court cases. And again, I'm going to hammer this home. I'm going to hammer it home in this talk that everything was very intentional that they did. So they started with cases as early as, you can see, 1849, right? In Boston, in fact, and went all the way for, you know, a good, you know, almost 100 years fighting this idea of segregation in education. And a lot of these cases were test cases. If one failed, they would find another family, another plaintiff, and they would bring another case. And the man on the left is extremely important in this story, and few people have heard of him. His name is Charles Hamilton Houston, and he was actually the architect. He spent a good 30, 40 years going throughout the South, taking photos of these dilapidated schools, figuring out legal strategies. He was a lawyer extraordinaire, bringing case after case after case to just try to really break the yoke of this Plessy v. Ferguson decision. Okay, and so again, they brought case after case. The NAACP was very involved. And I'll also say this, and one thing I think we don't appreciate is that, you know, if you see the earliest case from 1849, Roberts v. the City of Boston, all the way down to 1949, Webb v. School District number 90. You know, these are just little court cases for us, and for lawyers, these are citations. But in fact, there are individuals and families behind these cases. And the sheer amount of bravery it took for them to file these cases. What we don't really appreciate, especially in 2020, is the amount of violence that was associated with Jim Crow, with segregation. And that if you were one of these parents that decided, I'll sue my local school district, the threat of violence, the Ku Klux Klan's lynching was very real. So this was just a sheer act of just sheer bravery, not just for their own child to get a quality education, but for their community as well. So I think we need to recognize the bravery. You can go to the next slide. So there was a very important case that few people know about that happened before Brown v. Board of Education. And although we had those numerous cases in the last slide, none of them quite got us there until Mendez v. Westminster. And little was known about her. This was actually a Mexican-American family out of Orange County, California. And up to that point, Mexican-Americans have been considered white for these purposes, segregation purposes. However, this one particular town decided to segregate all the Mexican students, and their reasoning was that these people spoke Spanish and, they needed a separate school. And so they put them in very dilapidated schools, much like African-American children were in the South. And so her father brought a case against the school district, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it was basically held unconstitutional. Now, this is what's interesting though, and a lot of folks got very excited about it, although we as lawyers know that even if you win a court case, that's great. But what's even better is why you won it, right? The legal underpinnings of why you won it. So in this case, they did in fact rule it to be unconstitutional. However, their reasoning was that it was unconstitutional because it wasn't sanctioned by the state, and instead this local school district sanctioned it. So although that was a win for that particular family, that particular Mexican community, it did not overturn Plessy v. Ferguson. It did not overturn separate but equal. And again, that was the real linchpin. But it did give us an opening, right? It did provide an opening for us to now go all the way up, hopefully to the Supreme Court, and hopefully overturn Plessy. You can go to the next slide. So Brown v. Board of Education. So we had Mendez v. Westminster, and now here we are in 1954. These are the children whose parents brought the lawsuit. It was in the school district in Topeka, Kansas. Oliver Brown was the father of the young girl there, and she lived closer to the white school in her neighborhood. But because she was Black, they were going to bus her all the way to the Black school. So Thurgood Marshall, he's the man on our left side. He was a NAACP lawyer extraordinaire. Just did marvelous things, honestly, with respect to civil rights and the law. Later became a Supreme Court justice himself. He was the attorney. Again, they had been testing cases and testing cases and testing cases all over the country, and then voila, they found the perfect test case. So Oliver Brown, he was a head plaintiff, hence why his name is Brown, and 12 other plaintiffs filed suit against the school district of Topeka, Kansas. And in the Supreme Court decision, they overruled Plessy. It was finally overruled at this point, and hence the Supreme Court declared that separate is not equal. There was a lot of rejoicing, a lot of hope, but of course, it wasn't. It was a lot of rejoicing and a lot of hope, but of course, if you are going to desegregate the schools throughout the country, and especially in the South, of course, there's going to be a lot of resistance, right? You can go to the next slide. So that's why I have victory, sort of. So Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, separate, not equal. And there you can see this cartoon, I think, illustrates it best, looking at Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, Brown v. Board, 1954. So that was a monumental victory for the civil rights movement. Again, I go back to all of the advocacy, all of the activism that went into this. Again, this wasn't a one-hit wonder. This wasn't a miraculous case that someone just thought one day to bring, and voila, you get there. But Plessy v. Ferguson, from Plessy v. Ferguson to Brown v. Board of Education, really represents close to 100 years of deep thinking and strategy on the part of African Americans to really move and make a seismic change to this country. After Brown, separate, not equal, was the law of the land. Desegregation was the law of the land. It would take, another, honestly, 50 years to make schools truly integrated. And even to this day, they're still not integrated. We still have huge education disparities between African-American communities and white communities, between poor communities and wealthy communities. So the fight is far from over. Busing became a big issue. There was a lot of white flight. Also, there was a lot of hostility to these young, brave African-American children who did try to integrate once Brown was decided. So the fight wasn't over after that Supreme Court decision. The fight is not over now. However, this did provide huge momentum to again move the country forward. So as we go forward, some resources if you really want to delve deeper into this, both as a legal strategy, but just even from historical record. Separate is not equal. It's just that I have children, so I always like to get books for kids on these issues. This is a great book about the Menendez family. I was telling you about that Mexican-American family from California. Separate is not equal, sort of the precursor to Brown v. Board of Education. This trilogy is absolutely fantastic. It's by Taylor Branch, Parting the Waters. And if you really want to know about the strategy of the civil rights movement, the strategy of the King years, he nails it. He really gets it right. And it's a trilogy, and it just goes very deep into strategy. You also have this book here on Plessy v. Ferguson. Silent Covenants by Derek Bell. He was just a phenomenal constitutional law professor, African American. In fact, one of my mentors, he taught me, and he really just delves very, very deep into the unfulfilled promises of Brown, because there are unfulfilled promises. And then there's this DVD box set, Eyes on the Prize, and it talks about the American Civil Rights Movement, and it goes very deep into that as well. And then this is honestly Eyes Off the Prize. So she's a mentor of mine as well, Carol Anderson. And this, I talked earlier about solidarity in the international community. Well, this book really delves into how, in a lot of ways, though there were some positive movements with international solidarity for our civil rights leaders, there were some disappointments as well, because you have to keep in mind that the US is a superpower. It does have, a lot of clout on the international stage. And so this book really goes into how these are leaders of the NAACP. And this goes into how a part of their strategy, back to strategy, how they tried to engage the United Nations, the international systems, but because of the power of the US, those doors were shut where they should have been open. So that's very telling. And then lastly, NAACP Legal Defense Fund. They're doing absolutely phenomenal work. My husband and I, we attended their gala a couple of months ago before everything shut down. This was back in the fall. And this is basically the legal arm of the NAACP. So this is the arm that, if you think back to Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston, this is their arm. So it'd be great to check out their website and just to see what they're working on. Very thinly staffed, a very, very modest budget, and able to really do groundbreaking work back then and even to this day. So it would be great to get on their website. So that's my presentation in a nutshell. Again, I'm Tiffany Gardner, and Dana Oz is the co-founder of One World with me. We're very excited to be able to present to you and to share and to exchange and to support each other. If you have any further questions, our emails are here. Please reach out to us. The website for One World is here as well. And please follow us on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. But more importantly, we see this. We've been, working with Priya and Mangesh, and you're very, committed and dedicated leaders for about 10 years now. So we see ourselves as part and parcel to your movement, and we see you as part and parcel to our movement. So we want to definitely keep the solidarity growing and building. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Tiffany, for a wonderful presentation. The way you have laid out and make it more understandable for the people here, particularly the aspects of domestic solidarity, going across different organizations, building solidarities with various groups. Also the international solidarity, mass mobilization, and the legal aspect of each, particularly the examples you cited, and the legal arm of NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund and Education. Your presentation has certainly has invoked many questions on that, and there are few questions we will certainly take. And I do remember Dana's gift of those DVDs, the prize, the eyes on the prize, when we had those exchange program. So coming one of the question which is coming up is certainly on the affirmative action. We'll come on the presentation aspect, but one of the question which is popping up in the forum is affirmative action. You know, there is a similar program policy in India, which is known as reservation, right? So how the status of positive discrimination in United States today?
Affirmative action.
Yeah, affirmative action.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I will say is that if you look at coming out of the 60s and that civil rights movement, you had you had more of a firm commitment, let's say, to affirmative action as a remedial measure for the harm that had been done, probably than any other time. Now, you still didn't get back to, again, that Reconstruction period, right? We've never gotten back to that, right? But affirmative action is probably after that time, and again, it was nowhere near there, but affirmative action was probably the next time where you saw this national government say, okay, let's really think intentionally about remedial programs and actions to right some of these wrongs, okay? But, you know, over the past, 20 to 30 years, it has slowly been chipped away. Again, back my lawyer here, through various lawsuits. And interestingly enough, when you think about the law and civil rights, one of the biggest, I talked about the separate but equal, well, one of the biggest provisions in our Constitution is the 14th Amendment, right? And that's the Equal Protection Clause. And that was one of the amendments that was added to the Constitution after slavery had ended, saying that, all citizens, and this was really to bring African Americans, the formerly enslaved, into that all citizens, right? Because before we weren't considered citizens, right? So all citizens had equal protection under the law, right? You're all treated equally under the law. So that 14th Amendment was by and large created for that formerly enslaved man, woman, and their progeny. Well, as you think about affirmative action, especially in the 80s and the 90s and in the late 70s, when you had all these lawsuits against it, well, they used the Equal Protection Clause. And the argument was that, well, hey, listen, if all citizens are meant to be created equally, if we allow this person, and because of the color of their race, then I'm not being treated equally, and therefore it's encroaching upon my 14th Amendment equal protection. So that's just the irony of it. But I do have to say that, over the past 20, 25, 30 years, it's not what it was at first. Also, the band of individuals that are protected by it has broadened. But I think for me, and I think it's an evolving process, but the thing that I think a lot about is, yes, remedies for race, but also there's a class dynamic going on as well, right? And making sure that we're hitting also these disparities among race and class. And a lot of times they run together, right? So it's hard to parse them out. But at the same time, if you really think about, let's take universities. That's also a hot topic, right? Who gets in, who doesn't get in, and why. That's always what everyone's fighting about, right? Well, there's a couple of things going on there, right? For those, and there are very few slots, let's start for that. For those very few slots, let's say, where people of color, and we're talking about African Americans here, where African Americans are getting in, by and large, they're not necessarily from the communities, let's say, or sort of the ground level where I would personally like to see people coming from, right? Usually, usually these are individuals that have some kind of access to resource, maybe not a whole lot, and maybe not as much as their white counterparts, but still some kind of access to resource. So let's think about really how are we doing this thing and also addressing poverty, because I don't know if these programs necessarily address poverty. That's number one. Number two is that, and this is probably the biggest the biggest fallacy of them all, is that when you think about affirmative action and preference program and preferential treatment at the university level, by and large, for those small number of, Black and brown folk that may get in, they pale in comparison to legacy admits, right? So legacy admit is that if your parent went to one of these fancy schools, or your grandparent went to one of these fancy schools, well, then you'll get a little bit of extra consideration, sometimes a lot of extra consideration. Or if you're an athlete going to one of these fancy schools and they want to boost their sports program, you'll get a little extra consideration, right? Or if you just happen to be from a wealthy family and they cut a very nice donation, and we just saw that scandal in Hollywood, about a year ago now, where they're cutting checks and paying off these recruits and all that. Hey, we just found out about it, but it's always going on, right? So there's been a lot. That's what it is. There's been a lot of the gaming of the system that's outside and apart from affirmative action. So if you think about those small little dribs and drabs of people that are able to get into these schools versus like this huge gaming that's going on, it's almost laughable to even make this an issue. But it has become a big issue.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Tiffany, for summing up that on that particular subject. Dana, you want to respond on that question of affirmative action?
Yeah, no, I think that Tiffany covered it quite comprehensively. The only thing I don't want to, repeat what she said, but just one thing that I would add is this issue of equity, and you touched on it a little at the end, but sort of this concept of, other admits, and who are those who get in, and once they get in, have they gotten in on merit, or have they gotten in based on, this affirmative action gift? And we also find, by and large, those who get in through affirmative action admission are at the level or even exceed the level, right? So there's also this kind of myth, and I would imagine that's in any society that's dealing with as well, is dealing with some sort of affirmative action admission. There's also this kind of weight as do you actually belong? And you find, by and large, you do belong, and and those who are able to take advantage of affirmative action policies do belong. And then there's also the sort of the equity. Sorry, I have a volume issue, but there's also, as Tiffany mentioned, the band of those of individuals who are admitted through affirmative action has, of course, expanded over the years. So you kind of have a face of affirmative action, right? But we know it's quite broader than that, and it includes, women of all races, including white women, right? So it includes people of all races, but there's a sort of, kind of affirmative action profile, if you will. So, there are kind of the sort of legal aspects of it, the equity aspects of it, and also kind of, the psychological aspects of it. And I think that we're beginning to grapple with these issues and speak about them more vocally in these days and times. And I was particularly touched by Michelle Obama's Becoming book, where she really kind of pulls the wool out, or uncovers some of these sort of underlying pernicious attitudes about the abilities of people who have taken advantage of affirmative action policies. So that's all I would add to that.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I would just quickly jump in and say, Dana, you hit the nail on the head. And the other thing, when we talk about sort of this idea that if you're a person of color, if you're an African American in particular, somehow do you belong there? Can you cut it there? You got in on affirmative action. Well, we talked about the legacy admits, we talked about the athletes, we talked about, making these donations or paying off these people. But we also didn't talk about all the tutoring that goes on throughout high school. All the prep courses, right? So if you're able to pay for a tutor and get rock the SATs, which is sort of our college admissions exam, you know what I mean? Or if you have a tutor all throughout high school, you have these amazing grades. Is it really merit? Are we really talking about merit now? Like, what's really going on here? So these are the kind of sort of uncovering of the wool, as Dana said, conversations that are starting to happen and need to happen more often.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and similar is the situation in India. I mean, yes, this subject needs more attention, We can see the comparison of affirmative action in United States and reservation policy in India, go through the statistics and try to see. As you mentioned, another important aspect you mentioned, Dana, is of psychologically and equity, right? So these are certainly the very important aspects when we talk about this policy. And we are hosting uh, a discussion on reservation uh, in a near time. But certainly we will come back to this subject and we will try to see the comparison on these two aspects, two policies of affirmative action, or what we call it as a positive discrimination in United States. So coming back to the subject and presentation, there are some few more questions, Tiffany. Uh, as you said, uh, sort of churches or religious institutes were at the base of this sort of campaign. Uh, so one of the question which is coming up is that there were other religious organizations like Ku Klux Klan, sort of, I mean, more fundamental and so on. How religious institutions dealt with this sort of dilemma within the ministries, within the layer of pastors, fathers, and so on.
So as a question, how did the civil rights leaders deal with hate groups like the Ku Klux Klans and their tie to religion?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't, not at all, right? I mean, so what I mean is that, the Ku Klux Klans was a violent domestic terror, and still is a violent domestic terrorist group, right? And so once you encounter the Klan, as they call it, in the South or anywhere in this country, you're not going to encounter them in anybody's church with a white robe on and let's sit down and let's talk, right? So when these civil rights leaders encountered this hate group, it was more often than not, it was a violent confrontation, right? So just so that we understand sort of exactly the role that the Ku Klux Klans played in all of this, a lot of them, you didn't know who they were anyway, right? So part of the terror was that they were covered up, right? So these weren't men who were knocking at your door on a white sheet and would take off the white sheet and say, hey, let's sit down and let's talk about how we as Christians can work together, right? So a part of it was the shielding and the covering. When they did come, a lot of them came at night. When it was dark, again, it was sheer terror. This was domestic terrorism. These are domestic terrorists. That's what this is, right? Also, when not only would they come in the cover of night and be clothed and be sort of disguised, but a lot of them were, the leaders of the local town, right? So it would be your mayor, it would be your police chief, it would be your, the registrar at the court, it'd be even your judge at the court, right? So therefore, they were able to keep sort of the status quo going and the power structure going in these towns through this system of terror, right? Now, whoever asked the question is absolutely right that on Sunday morning they did worship at church, right? They did consider themselves Christian. Again, that was at a time also in this country where most folks were Christian anyway. So your Christianity might be a little bit different from my Christianity, or to say that I'm a Christian does not necessarily mean that what I think of as a Christian is what you think of as a Christian, right? But again, this would not have been a group that they would have sat down with and tried to sort of make solidarity with, to try to come to a meeting of the minds. This group was totally in existence to terrorize, to threaten, to kill, and to stop any progress that these civil rights leaders were trying to make. I don't know if you want to add something to that.
I would just add Tiffany and her really just wonderful presentation really did a good job of talking about the liberating aspect of theology, right? That the church was the underpinning of the civil rights movement. We also have to talk about sort of religion as used as a means of oppression, right? So it's that double-edged sword. And African Americans never lost their spirituality throughout, the time of being in this country, but from, or being in the United States, but from the start, sort of Christianity, has definitely been used as a tool of oppression, but also used as a tool of liberation. And there's that interesting interplay between the two. an unfortunate interplay, right? So when you think about the civil rights movement, what comes to mind as well is Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, right, where he is writing to white clergymen who have, essentially criticized the civil rights movement and criticized the resistance, if you will. And King, as much as he was in the pulpit, he was also saying that, you if it goes against liberation, if it goes against our freedom, then we are not to uphold these principles, right? So, um, you know, I think it's a testament to those who were struggling that they didn't allow groups like the Ku Klux Klan and like the white clergymen who were not in support of the civil rights movement to derail their spirituality or their ability to use its principles and tenets to forward the movement. But I think it's important to acknowledge the role that religion can play, used incorrectly. It can be a double-edged sword, so to speak. Thus, I just wanted to touch on that.
And yes, exactly. And a great book, a great body of work if one really wants to delve into this, and how religion, in particular Christianity, has really been used as a liberating force in African American history and in our struggle. It's an author, not even an author, he's actually a theologian by the name of James Cone, Cone, and he has this theory that he developed generations ago called Black liberation theology. Right. And it's a huge, profoundly revolutionary, liberating theology that, for me, we sort of had this idea of King as sort of this nonviolent peacemaker. Well, he was a radical. He was a radical, and he was a danger to the system and to the society, right? And so he was definitely a student of Black liberation theology. And a lot of these, pastors and clergymen that come out of the Black church, again, it's not sort of, the jovial, pot belly, innocent pastor, but there's a liberating, radical, revolutionary force that comes out of the Black church. And this Black, even during slavery times, right, when the enslaved people would meet for church and go to meeting, and a lot of the songs that we would sing that on the surface of it sounds very innocuous, very go down Moses, sweet Moses. It sounds very innocuous, but in fact, the slaves are speaking in code. The enslaved people are speaking in code and talking about escape and running away. So how we've used religion in this country throughout the years has been a comfort, has allowed for our survival in very harsh times, in a society, and a lot of times it was actually against your own survival. So it was a comfort, it was a hope, it was a healing, but it was also a radicalizing force as well. And again, if anyone's interested in delving more into this, look into Black liberation theology.
Yeah, that's very important point, Tiffany, and related on the same. I mean, you bring out that the radical aspect of Dr. King in his later part of the life, and mostly, but it has been sort of portrayed that Malcolm X was more radical and was not very supportive of civil rights movement. So how do you see religious conversion among the Afro-Americans had played a role in sort of liberation, as well as seeking the rights, constitutional rights, which was guaranteed in the Constitution of America, and sort of civil rights?
How do I see the use of religion, you said? Or?
Yeah, religious conversion among Afro-Americans.
Religious conversion?
Yeah.
There was an interesting article that came out maybe about 8 months to a year ago, and I believe it was in the New York Times. And the premise of the article was that it was just phenomenal. It might have been in the Atlantic Monthly, or whenever it was. It was this amazing article, and it was by this African American woman that talks about how African Americans saved U.S. democracy, right? And how it's really been, and not even saved it, but allowed for it, right? So it's actually our presence in this country from the very beginning that has allowed this country to be what it is in terms of like one of the greatest democracies in the world and in world history. Because in fact, although in the very beginnings of this country, we did not have a right to that very democracy, we were the ones who deeply believed in it more than anyone else, and we deeply held to the principles that all men are created equally, the principles in the Bill of Rights, or the principles in the Declaration of Independence, the principles in the Constitution, that we held to that so deeply that we were the ones that basically forced this nation, right? That forced this nation to live up to those same principles, right? And so if you look at our own struggle in this country and our own movement in this country, we forced the nation in that respect to live up to those principles, but then it even extends beyond us, right? So as I talk about the Reconstruction period, right, and how that was one of the greatest times when African Americans were in the Senate, were in Congress, were in governorships, it was also during that time when we passed the Immigration Act. And it was an African American effort to make sure that other people from other countries were able to come to this country freely, right? So it's those kind of things that people really don't make the connection between the role that African Americans have played, not just in our own in particular struggle for independence, but how we have also paved the way really for this country to be the true democracy that it's supposed to be, for women, for immigrants, for refugees, you know, for Latinos, for Asian Americans. It's really that work, that initial work. So I think that answers some of your question, that we, you know, as a community, as a unit, just really believe in the principles in this country and really pushing for and making this country live up to those principles. Like, we've been that voice crying in the wilderness, we've been that voice, right? And I think the way the religion plays into that, or at least has historically played into that, is, again, you got to read Black liberation theology, because it comes from this place of almost, you know, of course, Christianity, Jesus Christ, it comes from this place of a radical Christ, right? That Christ was here, you know, for the orphans and the widows, right? That Christ himself was a revolutionary, right? If you look at his life on earth, he was a revolutionary. He was definitely not status quo, part of the reason why he was crucified. So a lot of us really take our positioning in a religious sense, and then the social activism that's married to it through this notion of liberation theology.
And just to add to what Tiffany was saying, you were mentioning the work by Nicole Hannah-Jones, and I would
Right.
Really recommend to anybody to read the 1619 Project. And so basically, you know, 2019 was a 400-year anniversary of the first enslaved Africans coming to America, to the Jamestown colony. And she wrote an amazing piece. I think it may have gotten her definitely nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. I think actually
I think it did get it, yeah.
Got the Pulitzer Prize for really, like Tiffany said, just doing an amazing job of going through the history and the contributions, and you know, just really a retrospective of everything that's happened since then. So I would definitely recommend the 1619 Project. On the question of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, sometimes I find it to in some ways be a false dichotomy of sorts. You know, because as they both, you know, when we think about Martin Luther King, as Tiffany mentioned, he was actually a radical in some regards thinker, right? When I think about the, you know, the March on Washington and the I Have a Dream speech, I call it the insufficient funds speech, because the way he started the speech was so revolutionary, right? That was, to me, that was the point. And, you know, and then at the end, you know, he got carried away with that ad lib of I Have a Dream, which was amazing, but it was actually not a part of the speech. That was, you know, that was the extra icing on the cake. But he said, we came here to the nation's capital today to cash a check. We don't believe that check should come back marked insufficient funds, right? So he was with the urgency of now, you know, which of course ultimately inspired Barack Obama and you know, what he was able to do. So, you know, and then when you look at them at the end of their lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
King was talking about the Poor People's Campaign, and you know, getting at those issues of equity across racial lines, and also Malcolm X was kind of coming to that place too, right? Which meant that those two leaders were taken out. So I think in terms of our movements, it is really important to see where religion is positioned, right? Because religion is something that moves so many people. And I know, you know, there's of course the debate within your community, right? About, you know, Hinduism versus Buddhism and liberation theology and what that means. You know, but I think that it's important to kind of understand that and to not let it be a divisive, not let it be a divisive factor but really kind of get that revolutionary root. And so there are some corollaries or some comparisons between the two religious issues, but in some ways they're also different.
Yeah, thank you, Dana. Thank you. That's very important, not to be a divisive factors and use religious sort of practices and spirituality as a way forward for liberation.
That's true.
Coming back to Legal Defense Fund and NAACP, Tiffany, there is a question uh, which says what role NAACP and LDF played uh, in the court battles, and how it impacted.
Okay. So the NAACP, LDF, they provided the lawyers. I talked about Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was an NAACP lawyer. So they provided the legal team, the legal strategy. They provided the funding. So they were, again, a part of, again, if you think about, and I go back to intentionality, that this was a very strategic approach to getting African-American liberation and rights. The legal part was just as much a part of the marches, right? Just as much a part of the solidarity building. And so the NAACP, you can think of it as, if you think of sort of the whole strategy and the sort of the different buckets and pots of the strategy, the NAACP was sort of the legal part of the strategy.
Yeah, yeah.
And just one footnote to the last comment about just Malcolm and Martin, a very quick footnote, because thinking about the situation there in your movement as well. And I would say that between Malcolm and Martin, their biggest difference was probably one being from the North in New York City and one being a Southerner versus one being Muslim and one being Christian. Like that has never parts of, like, the issue was that, oh, he was Muslim and he was Christian, therefore that's where the differences came. But I think that just, I've never heard that narrative of that being the difference. But I think a lot of it could be, and we talk a lot about this is, and I'm from Harlem, right? Where I live right down the street from where Malcolm's mosque was, but my family's from the South, okay? And so just culturally, there is a very big difference there, just in approach and the way that the oppression looked as well, right? So I think those two things probably mattered more and kind of fared more in how they differed versus one being Muslim, one being Christian.
Really good point.
Yeah. There is another question, which is like, you rightly pointed, Tiffany, that yes, the lawyers played the role, the activists played the role, and you also said that the funding played an important role in sort of sustaining it. The question is, Tiffany, how this support structure for litigation was carried further? Because if you take those legal battles by LDF, were not easy during that situation. I mean, there were hardly people from Black community representing in judiciary or legislature. So in that socio-political situation, and considering the representation of judiciary, yes, we all talked about that judiciary is very independent and so on, but we know it's the system which they are being appointed and so on. So how they sustain it?
Right. It's very difficult, honestly. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that a lot of the funding, yes, did come from the NAACP, but a lot of their funding came from donors. And those donors were white and Black, very wealthy people. Rockefellers, Nelson Rockefeller was a big financial supporter of the movement. So again, that's back to that solidarity, that you start with the base, but you have to spread out. So again, just to be very clear in terms of the funding and the financial solidarity, economic solidarity, it came from across races and across communities. Regarding, how difficult it is, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that, anyone who works with LDF, NAACP Legal Defense Fund today will say that they lose far more cases than they win. That's just the reality of it. In this country, our courts have, become more conservative. A lot of the judges are appointed. And, the Supreme Court justice, that's a lifetime appointment. So, if you really want to make change, you're talking about, possibly waiting a very long time to make change. I'll leave it at that. So it's very difficult work. It's very slow moving work. And yeah, they lose more than they win. Not necessarily because of the merit of the cases, but just because of the political nature of the cases. I would also say that, in the past 20 to 25 years, we do talk about this rollback, right? Talking about affirmative action in other programs, there has definitely been a concerted rollback of a lot of these programs. And a lot of that rollback has happened through the court system and a lot of the cases that have been brought.
Yeah. Dana, there is a question for you, particularly, that you've been engaged with sort of strengthening political landscape and working on sort of governance and democracy for a long period of time in various regions of the world. How you see the participation of Black activists, Afro-American activists in the political sphere in United States today, in the leadership, in the party structure, and so on?
In the United States?
How do you see the participation of Black youths, Black activists, Black professionals in the political parties in the United States? May it be Republican Party or may it be Democratic Party?
Yeah, I think that African American youth are certainly, politically active. I'm seeing a lot of interesting things bubbling up, with various celebrities as well around, coming of age in this time and the next the next election, mobilizing around the next election. I'm seeing a lot of interesting things in that regard. I think that we must continue to be engaged in political life and civic life and really be making our voices heard. In the United States, it's pretty much a given, right? Like that, African Americans are going to support the Democratic Party. And I'm for African Americans and people of all hues really being engaged in the political process across party lines, and really sort of engaging and making our voices heard in that way. So not to lean back, but to lean into civic life, and there's a role for us to play, regardless of the party. And like I said, I'm really kind of interested. There's a young star named Yara Shahidi. She's leading this initiative. I think it's called 18 and Road, or it's something of that nature. And you see a lot of like groundswell of youth involved in that. And sort of getting that excitement again for political life, because I think there definitely was a period somewhat of apathy, but I feel like I'm seeing more of this kind of civic engagement of our youth, and there's a role to be of course demonstrating on the outside, but there's also a role to be played in working within the systems and within the parties and trying to take leadership roles towards the future.
Tiffany, I know it's getting late for you, but can we have a couple of questions? They are coming up in the screen.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the question is, what are the social security policies for Afro-American communities today?
I laugh. What are the social security policies for African Americans? So the short answer is that there aren't any policies that are directly targeted at African Americans. When you think about sort of social policy, social programs, a lot of them in this country are geared towards those of economic disadvantage, poor communities. And so that is a way that if you're from a poor community, be it Medicaid, or be it public assistance, be it public housing, maybe you call it social housing in India, housing provided by the government. Those are based on income, right? But there's nothing that's sort of designated, particularly for, or no widespread program anyway, designated particularly for African American communities. In fact, I think some of us got pretty excited with this last round of the Democratic presidential primaries and candidates, when we had sort of a large number of them, because during that time, a lot of them had been talking about reparations and reparations for African Americans in particular. That kind of conversation has waned. We haven't heard as much about it, but it was interesting to hear that being talked, and probably one of the first times talked robustly on a national stage and part of a national conversation. There is an organization out there, and I'm not connected to them personally or anything, but I've read some of their stuff, which is pretty interesting. And it's ADOS, ADOS, American Descendants of Slavery, I believe is what the acronym stands for. And they really sort of have a whole kind of, point plan on if one were to provide reparations to the descendants of American slavery, what would that look like? Everything from, credits for college to, paying back student loans for them to, some very innovative things. I think one of the issues that we get into in this country is that, to be so difficult, it's so impossible. So that kind of like stops the conversation. But when you go on that website, you really see how well thought it is, and honestly, how not easy it is, but how not as difficult, I think, as we've made it seem. So that's the long and short of it. But in terms of sort of any concerted effort to sort of right those wrongs, again, Dana, you correct me if you think something differently, but I really don't see in the history of this country a time where there was a concerted effort, except for right after slavery ended and Reconstruction and the Freedmen's Bureau. A whole bureau was set up in the U.S. government to address, the plight of the formerly enslaved man and woman. And I just haven't seen anything like that since then.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
In this situation of COVID, you took up the case from Kansas, the Brown versus Board of Education case. And when we go through some of the reports, in Kansas, it says that deaths of Afro-American are 7 times higher than that of the others. So how you see the situation today when we have fought this long battle of separate but not equal and so on and so forth. And at this stage, when blacks in America have represented the presidentship, Barack Obama has represented that for 2 consecutive times. So how you see, the situation today, in particularly in responding to this COVID-19 pandemic?
So I guess I'll jump in. I think it really further underscores the disparities and the social determinants of health, right? And it's, it brings to fore a larger discussion around inequity and disparity and, institutional discrimination in the United States. The African Americans are amongst the worst impacted because we have, a lot of these comorbidities, right? These underlying health conditions, which have certainly a strong socioeconomic basis with regards to access to healthcare, with regards to living more in poverty than other races in the country. And I've seen a lot of discussion of this on television and in the news, which in some regards is encouraging. And I think we need to continue to have these discussions, because these are things that are, seething beneath the surface, and these are sort of endemic to the American society, if you will, right? These historic inequities that continue on. And I think we need to have candid conversations, as Tiffany was mentioning. It is encouraging to see that in the last, the primaries, that there was this discussion of reparations and from multiple candidates, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, there is a need to have these discussions and to make actual concrete movements towards addressing historical and structural inequities in the United States that bring us, what do they say when when the rest of the country gets a cold, the African American community gets the flu. So, we need to definitely address why this is the case, and continue to have these discussions, and make concerted effort and movements in this area.
Mhm. And I'll say to that, I'm actually hopeful. I'm very, so I have small children, and we talk about history, and in particular our history, a lot. And funny enough, my fourth grader, his class, they're studying Brown v. Board of Education and school desegregation now. And we just had this conversation earlier today. And I think that I'm extremely, extremely proud to be an African American. I'm extremely proud of our history. I'm proud of the trials that we've overcome, but I'm also very proud of the triumphs and just how well we're doing here in this country. Maybe despite or maybe because of, but I think we've done amazingly well. I'm very excited for the future. I'm seeing a shifting and a changing in the conversations. I'm glad to see us on the right and on the left. I'm very glad of that as well, and that the conversation is getting richer. And I'm glad to see non-African Americans having these conversations. In fact, when that poor young man was gunned down in Georgia just 2 months ago, and we all kind of just found out about it, I was very glad to see more than just African Americans outraged by that. So I think that, my father, he was one that came from Alabama, and he grew up in the segregated South, and he grew up, with all those threats that I talked about earlier, being a reality for him. And his grandfather was a sharecropper. And here, I went off to Yale University, and I'm a lawyer, and my sister's a doctor. And I think that that is a testament, yes, to the American dream, to the abilities. One can be whatever one wants to be in the U.S. Yes, I'll give it to that. I love my country, definitely. But in particular, it's a testament to the African American, to the African American spirit and will and drive and determination. And I think that, the world has a lot to learn, yes, from the American experience, but in particular from the African American experience. You cannot parse the American experience away from the African American experience. And a lot of the American experience is the African. I always say, when you think about the American Revolution, when this country first began, it was a Black man. He was the first casualty of the American Revolution was Crispus Attucks, a Black man. And from that point forward, we have been shaping and forming and molding and moving and pushing this country to be a better version of itself. And I'm extremely proud of that.
Very true. More power to you, Tiffany, and more power to you, David. Yeah. Last question there is coming up, that can there be an exchange program of Dalit students and Afro-American students in near future, and how we can work together on it?
We would love that. We would love it. That's called One World.
Exactly.
Yeah, so in
Let's
fact,
do it.
I know we got to get COVID under control. That is kind of a reaching everybody's plan. I can't leave my house, let alone get on a plane. But no, honestly, many moons ago, when Dana and I thought about One World, and when we envisioned it, we both said, wow, look at us. And back to that narrative I was just saying, 2 African-American women. And here we have Dana as an international development expert, traversed the whole world and done all these high-powered jobs and meeting with heads of states. And here I am, the international human rights lawyer, going all over the world, bringing, or at least trying to bring justice, and saying, how can we get more people with our background, and maybe even without our background, but that don't have access to this? How can we give them access? And one of our first missions was to India. And in fact, that first delegation that we took, if you guys remember Hurricane Katrina in 2006, right? And talking about laying bare all of these disparities, well, much like COVID is doing, Hurricane Katrina laid bare a lot of these disparities and the hardships that the community was still facing. And we brought a group of young people. They were from all over the country, but in particular, we brought a group of people in that delegation from New Orleans who were survivors of the flood, survivors of Katrina. And that was a very impactful experience. So thank you guys for hosting them. I mean, that was very impactful for them. And one day we'll talk offline, Priya and Gesh, just about how impactful that was. So, and we got written up on all these papers and all that. And wherever Dana and I go, we always talk about the Dalit experience, honestly, because I think in this country, unfortunately, that's just something that's not as spoken about. When we do meet our friends from India, India, and I have quite a few, this experience is rarely articulated, right? So a lot of us we know, but a lot of us in this country just don't know. So Dana and I make it a point to articulate it wherever we go, and we shout it all over social media, all over Instagram about Dalit rights or human rights and about that experience. So with that being said, anything we can do to make that exchange happen, we've tried it, we've done it in the past, and we want to do more of it in the future. So
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You wanna add anything to Tiffany?
No, I
Dana?
think Tiffany covered it all. Let's make it happen. I mean, once this
Yeah,
this
yeah.
COVID thing is past us, because we would have loved to do something this coming summer. And it's also our dream that at some point we are able to make it a two-way exchange, with bringing Indian youth, to the United States as well, or some other far-flung location. But really, like, let's see where the world ends up after all of this. Where I'm at right now, I'm in Dhaka, and literally there are no passenger flights leaving.
We'll
So,
see you soon.
I
We'll see you
really,
soon.
and I'll just take this opportunity to say, wherever you are, I hope you're safe, and I hope your families are safe, and that you're respecting the various physical distancing measures, and that we all get to the other side of this pandemic.
Yeah, we will continue to learn from each other. We will continue to exchange, and there are many more things which can be drawn parallel at a national level, at an international level, and that this solidarity is going to help at various forums. Thank you for joining, Tiffany and Dana. Stay tuned,
Well,
and we'll come back to this subject again.
we will, and I have to say, Priya, you're about the only one, you and Mangesh and all of you, about the only one that can get me to be up till 1:30 in the morning. Well, when I have two little boys that I have to homeschool first thing tomorrow, but you guys are the only ones that can get me up or get me staying up this late.
So sorry for that, Dana. We will
No, it's my
work out on
pleasure.
another time sometime. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you, viewers, for joining us today. We'll be back on this subject again. Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.